Welcome to this week's lecture in the Principles of Medical Device Design and Innovation. And today we're going to talk a little bit about brainstorming and its role in the design and innovation process. Brainstorming has some myths associated with it, and what I'd like to do in the next couple of minutes is dispel some of those myths, particularly how brainstorming and this role of ideation has a very significant role in the context of the innovation process. And then actually a brainstorming session is not as free-flowing as some people might think. A lot of planning and execution is required to get it right. And of course there are special issues specific to biotechnology innovation, invention and innovation, and this pertains primarily to the participants you bring to the table when you conduct the brainstorming session. This lecture is extensively supplemented by Chapter 3 in the Biodesign book, specifically Section 3.1, and I would encourage you to read those 17 pages. It's a fantastic authored portion of the book, and it's very, very illustrative. And of course, this lecture is extensively supplemented by you, because you can exercise the techniques in many different settings, not just in class, and actually not just in the biodesign domain. Going back to our 3 stages of biodesign, of identify, invent, and implement, brainstorming is really one of the key steps in the invent process right before concept screening and concept selection. And you'll remember those slides, and of course the book has some diagrams that underscore the relationship between the brainstorming and concept screening and selection. And what we kind of have to do is step back and take a look at that diagram and realize that the biodesign process involves a series of convergent and divergent activities. Brainstorming is one of those activities where you diverge a little bit and you create a lot of ideas that you subsequently converge on through key opinion leaders. So, playing off of Chris Riker at Nottingham Spurk, he put this slide together, and he basically describes that brainstorming is a group creativity technique designed to create a large number of ideas for the solution of a problem. This process has been around for quite a while, actually, introduced in 1953 by Alex Osborne in this book, Applied Imagination. If you have a chance, pick that book up. It's kind of fascinating. I haven't read the whole thing. I've just read parts of it, and essentially you get this clear sense that very, very early on people believed that groups could double their creative output with brainstorming. But it doesn't happen on its own. You have to structure the brainstorming session, and you have to run it properly with the right participants, and we'll talk about that shortly. Going back to the waterfall process, knowing that the FDA design process really bears weight in everything we do for very good reasons, we would ask, where does brainstorming fit in the waterfall process? And is it just in establishing user needs, or plays in design input? Where might this brainstorming go? And if we think about the slide we just looked at, group, process to problem solving, creative problem solving, you can argue that the brainstorming can be used in every step of the waterfall process, not just one. Even, for instance, one of the most difficult things to do for medical devices is the validation portion. And of course, validation and what the validation protocol looks like is not always obvious. And this is a case where the right team brainstorming specific parameters, there's just no substitute for that. Coming to a project to you soon. Sounds like a movie, doesn't it? Basically, when you think of the FDA requirement 820-30C about design input, you have to remember that brainstorming is more than just something we kind of do for fun. The manufacturer shall establish and maintain procedures. So brainstorming is a procedure to ensure, not insure, but to ensure that the design requirements are appropriate, and address the intended use of the device. This is understanding the intended use is not something we do in isolation. Do it as a team, and in this, of course, we make sure we can do this through the mechanism of brainstorming in terms of creative aspects to identifying all the design requirements. So the procedures shall include a mechanism for addressing incomplete, ambiguous, So brainstorming is a very, very helpful technique if you're faced with an ambiguous situation and you need to come up with some solutions. And of course, we can continue and look at the very last bullet that says the approval, including the date and signature of the individuals approving the requirements, shall be documented. And nothing beats having a very robust crew of people from interprofessionally, so that we know we've looked at the problem from all perspectives. Again, because the variety of perspectives will underscore and elucidate the intended use of the device beyond what the designer might initially think. So what does this really mean? I'm going to translate that again. Design input means that the physical and performance requirements of device are used for the basis for device design. So if we think about the waterfall process, we don't want to cut short the investment in the earlier steps. Limitations in the preliminary steps are critical path limitations farther on in the process because of the sunk cost and the number of phases that have gone by. Remember, what we're trying to do here is design the right product for the right customers, okay? And it's estimated that 1 of every 1,000 ideas successfully gets to the market. So what we have to have is communication between all interested parties and stakeholders. Now that's an easy statement to say, communication between all interested parties and stakeholders, and you may not have all those people around, but a good brainstorming session can identify issues. It can identify who we may need to communicate with that's not on the radar screen right away. So again, brainstorming is more than just creating ideas. It's actually come up again with creative solutions and pathways. It's more than just sitting around talking and putting post-it notes on a board. It is a process, and it's a process that creates value, and this value is created through group activities in problem solving. Taking a look at some of the steps in the waterfall process, knowing that the design input is a very critical one. And again, I'm emphasizing design input because this is the jump from the user need to the design input is where most of the engineers I work with tend to use brainstorming. Often there's a protocol for everything else. But basically, when we look at the development drivers, we have the user needs, we have safety requirements, and of course regulatory standards requirements. And so what we're doing is essentially we want to translate, if you will, the user need, we want to translate it into engineering terms. So when I talk about design input, what I'm talking about is a series of statements that you put together, that you shall display, and that you shall display 6 characters in a standard ASCII character set, that it's readable. Okay, these are very specific, and these kinds of specific details can emerge from a brainstorming session because let's just take, for instance, this idea, lighting by a patient with 20/20 vision at half a meter or further. I mean, this is, this isn't something that some of these more subjective parameters are not something that an engineer can often do in isolation, and the team you bring together, the clinical team, the nursing, the users and the regulatory can all be helpful in providing input on what makes sense in terms of a specification. And don't be afraid in the process of creating requirements to delete some. But of course you want to record that in fact that there was something there but it was deleted. Again, specificity in pH, all these parameters can come from a consensus statement that comes out of a brainstorming session. Don't underestimate the value of a consensus statement when there's ambiguity and the prevailing descriptions tend to be very subjective and you're absent objective. And you're looking for objectivity, you're looking for measurable parameters. You may not know, there may not be the research, and a good brainstorming session can come up with parameters that will bound the problem. Okay, so effective brainstorming, how do we do this? Well, let's kind of spend a little time here. Effective brainstorming requires focus. Some people will take a brainstorming session and so we're going to talk about this, talk about that. Don't bring to the table too many things you want to accomplish because unless you've got the right players, it's going to be very tough. And how many players would you have in a brainstorming session? How many do you think you would be needed? Well, we know that when groups get larger than 15, we move from information sharing and discussion to sort of a telling scenario, and that is more lecturing. So generally speaking, when you put together a brainstorming session, you may want to have between 10 and 15, and try to stick to the lower number, because that then there'll be more free-form talk. So the challenge, of course, is that you also want to have a variety of participants. You want to screen them. Not everybody who volunteers is the best person to have in a brainstorming session. So you're going to go through a process of screening and then selecting specific participants, and certainly diversity of thought is very, very critical. Often when we think of diversity, we think of cultural diversity, which is very valuable, but intellectual diversity is extremely important too. Many times one member of the team will want to be the facilitator, but that's not normally recommended, actually. The best practice, at least at the outside, is to go out and hire a professional facilitator, and this person doesn't need to have domain-specific knowledge. This can be just somebody who is a great facilitator. It helps if they know the general science, because then they can interpret the comments and things like that. But one way or another, get an external facilitator. Avoid having one of the members of your team or a senior corporate member actually do the facilitation. There's some subtle social dynamics, and you just won't get the conversation you're probably looking for. Again, active participation is something that comes from identifying the right screening, but you want to be sure that everybody is participating actively. And of course, one way to sort of manage this is it's unreasonable in brainstorming to have like a 4 or 8 hour session. It's more likely that you'll be productive with a 60 to 90 minute session, and that that you're going to do this over a series of days, or maybe once a week or twice a week for 2 weeks or something like that, to give people some time to reflect and think. But always look for active participation and address active participation offline. Or, again, a good facilitator will see that somebody's not participating, and they have excellent techniques for engaging that person and finding out what's on their mind. Again, set reasonable expectations. Don't say that, oh, we got this huge problem, we can't reconcile the differences, there's all these issues. Don't overpromise or don't overestimate what's going to come out of a brainstorming session. It takes a while for these sessions to be productive. Sometimes you're lucky and the first one's very, very productive. But have reasonable expectations so you don't have unmet expectations, which fosters the myth that brainstorming is sort of a Yahoo management thing to do that doesn't have any value. Because in fact, it does bring a lot of value to the design process. Brainstorming requires immersion. This is a contact sport. You can't just step aside, and I'm not asking you to do anything I wouldn't do myself. Most recently, I was involved in a life flight exercise, and what we were doing was essentially simulating the process of transporting a wounded person to the ER. And the issue was, what are some of the problems that might arise in communication during handoff? So that was kind of the focus of the activity, and so I was paired with a flight nurse, and this flight nurse and I simulated the receiving the patient from the ground, the activities while the patient was in flight, and of course the handoff to the ER. And so I'm not clinically trained. I'm an engineer, but the idea is that by immersing yourself in some of these activities, you get a first-hand feeling of what people are going through, and it really does change your perspective. And it gives you a chance to ask questions. I could ask all the medics. In the background here is a very, very experienced ER nurse, just a fantastic person, paramedic right here. And of course, we've got the people in flight that actually will do simulation. I don't know if they're trying to intubate or what they're trying to do here, but in any case, of course, at CASE we have a full 6 degree of freedom flight simulator, so we can actually simulate motion, and this actually adds to the realism of the activity. So once again, brainstorming, you have to immerse yourself. This is a contact sport. You're not going to win sitting on the sidelines. So, it's your move. This page is left intentionally blank, and what I'm trying to say here is that brainstorming is something you can read about, and I encourage you again to read section 3.1 of Biodesign. It's very, very good. But go out, find a place, find a group, set something up, even if it's small and formal with 2 or 3 people, well, 3 or 4 people. Set up a brainstorming session, even if it's at work, college, assignments. Create a situation or get engaged in a situation where you turn the page and you become involved, and you're not left with a blank stare, but in fact you're a material participant and you firsthand experience brainstorming. Do it at a small scale. Get accustomed to it. Get comfortable with the technique, and maybe you too can develop the facilitation skills necessary to run your own a brainstorming session. With that, I think I like to summarize and simply say brainstorming is a verb, not a noun. It's not the sort of thing that we look at. It's something we're engaged in. There are many, many managerial techniques involved in brainstorming, and so it helps to watch a few people. Go on YouTube and watch videos for brainstorming. You can see good, bad, and the ugly. It does take time to perfect the cultural context. So your particular company or your college or your team is going to have its own cultural context, and so good brainstorming requires being quick on your feet and being able to adapt the session to meet the needs of the people intended to serve. This says validation. Validation of the data and validation of your skill in participating in brainstorming. It's an acquired skill, just like validation we talked about in the waterfall process. Once again, it's a contact sport. An outcome, a minimum outcome of a good brainstorming session at the early stages of the medical device design and innovation process is a relevant set of design input specifications. Done right, you've launched your design effort off on the right foot with the right factors involved and on your way to a successful design activity.